history students. Welcome to Mrs. Hanson's history class. We are going to be trying to do some videos of the lecture time that you would normally have when you were taking notes. I'm going to be writing on the board. Hopefully this will all work out for you. I am not a YouTube personality, which is going to be painfully obvious as you watch my videos, but we're going to do the best we can. I think this will probably be good for some of you because I'm pretty sure there are many of you who have wanted to pause me during one of my lectures, and now is your opportunity. Before we get started, I want to make sure that you have your book open to chapter 8, section 1, and that you've got your notes out and ready to go. Once you've got everything you need, you can come back and hit play again and we'll get started. All right, chapter 8. Chapter 8 is the Jefferson era. If you look at page 262 and 263 in your book, you're going to see the timeline of the period of time that we're talking about. This chapter is actually a relatively short period of time. It only covers 1801 to 1815, but a lot of really important things happen during this time period. During this time period and other places in the world, you can see some pretty important things happening. In fact, in 1807, right in the middle of this chapter, the slave trade is abolished, that means done away with, in the British Empire. This is a really big deal. If you've ever wanted to know more about that, more about what the slave trade looked like in other places, I highly recommend a movie called Amazing Grace. It was filmed in 2006. I believe the rating is PG-13. It's a little hard to watch, but it's not super explicit. I think it would be okay for most of you to watch with your parents' approval, of course, but it does a really good job of talking about a particular Englishman named William Wilberforce and his struggle to end the slave trade in Great Britain. The reason it's called Amazing Grace is because John Newton, the man who wrote the hymn Amazing Grace that we're all familiar with, is a big character in this movie. He was friends in real life with William Wilberforce and was one of Wilberforce's biggest influences to try and work on getting the slave trade eliminated. So that's not particularly related to what we're doing now, but you can kind of understand that this is the time period we're working in. There's a revolt in Haiti, a slave revolt in Haiti that happens during this time period. A lot of stuff is going on. So let's start section 1. Now, as you know, because you've already finished chapter 6 and chapter 7, we've established our government. We've got our Constitution. We're learning how to work together as a country. And we come upon an election. It's an election year, the year 1800. We're starting the 19th century, and something very interesting is going to happen. There were two men that were running for president during this time period. The first was, of course, John Adams. John Adams was president number 2 of the U.S. So we had Washington and then we had John Adams. John Adams was a Federalist. That was the name of his political party. That was the political party that he belonged to. Now you may be confused. Wait, I thought we had the Democrats and the Republicans. Well, that's what we have now. In fact, you're going to be surprised to see how many different parties we go through before we settle on basically what we have now. The Federalist Party is what he was part of. The Federalist Party had some interesting beliefs, some interesting party platforms. They believed that democracy was ideal, that a republic was ideal, but they also believed that the ruling should be done by those who were wealthy and more educated. They believed in a strong central government. They believed in a big emphasis on industry and manufacturing. And they believed in a very loose interpretation of the Constitution. In the chapter before, chapter 7 that we just finished, we talked about the difference between loose construction and strict construction. And that's still an argument that politicians and judges go back and forth on today. 200 years later, we still haven't settled on one particular way to read the Constitution. The Federalists were also keen on the idea of an alliance with Great Britain. They felt like we should be on good terms with Great Britain. Now, John Adams ran against Jefferson, and he ran with a man named Charles C. Pinckney. Now, I say he ran with Charles C. Pinckney. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. It wasn't quite like what we have now. You know, we have, in our last presidential election, we had Donald Trump and his running mate Mike Pence. And Mike Pence was running for vice president with Donald Trump. It's not quite that way yet. In fact, the election of 1800 actually causes a big problem with the way the Constitution was written at first. And so because of that, we get the 12th Amendment. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's get to who he ran against. Thomas Jefferson was his opponent. Thomas Jefferson. Yes, that Thomas Jefferson. The guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence. He was super important in the founding of our nation. Thomas Jefferson was a member of a party called the Democratic Republican Party. Well, that sounds like a good party, right? Can we unite the Democrats and the Republicans? It's not really the same thing as what we have now. Thomas Jefferson was a member of the Democratic Republican Party. The Democratic Republicans believed in a little bit more of rule by the people. Now, they were still pretty keen on the idea of the upper class, the well-educated folks running the country, but they were a little bit more open about what that looked like. The Democratic Republicans believed in stronger state governments. So they wanted the federal government smaller and the state governments bigger. Jefferson himself, and if you watched the crash course video that I sent out last week, Jefferson himself was a big believer in an agrarian society. His dream, his vision for the U.S. was that we would be a nation of gentlemen farmers, that everybody would have their own plot of land, that we would grow our own food, less dependent on our own manufacturing. You know, we can import stuff that we need, but we should, you know, just sort of focus on the land and what the land could give us, and each person owning some land. And it's kind of interesting that he would say that, because Thomas Jefferson was a slaveholder. And so, you know, there's some tension there. The guy who wrote that all men are created equal actually owned other men. And so it's kind of an interesting thing to think about when we talk about Thomas Jefferson and all the great things he did and all the brilliant things he wrote. There's also some problematic things in his life. And so we have to remember, just as a reminder, that none of the people we're talking about here are perfect. And none of them got it completely right. But we don't want to discount what Thomas Jefferson did do that was good. We don't want to throw it all out, right? We want to focus on understanding who he was as a whole person. The Democratic Republicans also believed in a strict interpretation of the Constitution. Jefferson's point of view was, if the Constitution doesn't explicitly say it one way or the other, you know, you can't do it. So he was very interested in really sticking to the Constitution. Jefferson also was looking for an alliance with the French rather than the British. And so those are some of the things the Democratic Republicans were running on. Now, Jefferson was running with, and again, this is a little kind of iffy the way I say that, but Jefferson was running with a man named Aaron Burr. Now, you may recognize that name if you are at all familiar with the musical Hamilton that has been sweeping the nation the last few years. If you're not, well, you're going to find out about Aaron Burr because we're going to talk about him. He was pretty important. Okay, so back in this day and age, candidates didn't go around giving speeches. They didn't have, obviously they didn't have TV, they didn't have telephone, no radio, none of that stuff that we have today. And they didn't have the kind of transportation that would make what we call stump speeches possible. They couldn't get from place to place easily or quickly. And so one of the things that they did to campaign was they and their supporters would make arguments in the local newspaper, right? So they would write an editorial, they would write an article, vote for me because, or vote for my candidate because. You know, if I was a man that supported Thomas Jefferson, I might write an editorial or a letter to the editor in my local newspaper and say, we should all vote for Thomas Jefferson because, or if I were a man that was supporting John Adams, I would say we should all vote for John Adams because. Now, Adams's supporters, guys, this has been going on from the very beginning, what we might call mudslinging. It gets a lot worse later. This is pretty tame compared to some of the stuff that's gone on since then, but they still bashed each other in the press. That's nothing new. Adams supporters claimed that Jefferson was a pro-French radical. Now, some of you may be aware of what was going on in France around this time period, and that was the French Revolution. And the French Revolution was pretty bloody, was pretty horrible. We're actually going to talk about it some next year in world history. For those of you who are 7th graders who are going to be in my world history class next year, we're going to talk about the French Revolution. And to call somebody a pro-French radical sort of, you know, rings all these warning bells. One of the things they said was if you put Jefferson in office, then all this violence and all this chaos and all this bad stuff, you know, the guillotine and off with their heads and all that stuff that's going on in France, it's going to come here, right? Because Jefferson's a pro-French radical. Okay. Not really true. He was pro-French, wasn't really radical, wasn't interested in the guillotine and all that stuff that was going on over there like that, but that's how they painted him. That's how his opponents painted him. Federalists also believed that Jefferson's his interest in science and in philosophy meant that he wanted to destroy organized religion. They accused him of being an atheist, which he wasn't technically, but he struggled with religion and his idea of religion, and in fact, that's an interesting study all on its own, is Thomas Jefferson's relationship with religion. It was pretty complicated. But that's what they accused him of. Now, newspapers that were run by Democratic Republicans would run pieces against John Adams. And some of the things they said about John Adams was that he wanted to crown himself king. Now, you'll remember from Chapter 7, the Alien and Sedition Acts. Those were pretty harsh laws that were passed, cracking down on a number of different things. And these people that were for Thomas Jefferson were saying, you know, he wants to crack down on all this, on all of us. And he wants to make himself king, obviously. I mean, he wants us to ally with Great Britain, and he wants to be king. That wasn't true either. But you can see how this sort of grand tradition of slandering your opponent has continued on as we've grown as a country. They didn't come right out and say this. It was more of kind of they insinuated it. But one of the things they said about John Adams was that he was going to use the army to limit Americans' rights, because the army, a permanent army, had just been created. It was brand new. And they said he's going to use that to limit your rights. He's going to use that to crack down on you. The Alien and Sedition Acts and this new army, and he wants to be king. Okay. So that's what they were saying about each other. When the election results came in, here's what's interesting. And here's where we have some trouble. When the election results came in, Thomas Jefferson had 73 electoral votes. Aaron Burr had 73 electoral votes. John Adams had 64, and Charles Pinckney had 63. Now, here's where the problem is. During this time period, what the Constitution originally said was the top two vote getters. The top vote getter would be president, and the second biggest vote getter would be vice president. Do you see a problem here? Jefferson and Burr were tied. What's going to happen? Well, what happened was the House of Representatives was supposed to vote. The House of Representatives was supposed to decide then which man would be president. Here's the problem. The House of Representatives was also deadlocked in a tie. 35 votes they took. I mean, it got so bad, you had congressmen sleeping on the floor between the votes. This is how bad it got, 35 votes. On the 36th vote, here's what happened. A young man named Alexander Hamilton finally persuaded some of the representatives to not vote at all. They said, you don't have to vote for Jefferson, just don't vote for Burr. Don't vote for anyone. And because of that, Thomas Jefferson finally won on the 36th vote. He finally won. In fact, let's see, yes. Hamilton persuaded enough Federalists to cast blank votes to give Jefferson a majority of 2 votes, and Burr became vice president. Now, Alexander Hamilton was actually not a huge fan of Thomas Jefferson. He didn't agree with Jefferson on a lot of things. In fact, Hamilton really leaned more toward federalism, but he really disliked Aaron Burr, and he believed that Jefferson was a better alternative than Aaron Burr. And so here's what happens later on. Some of you may be familiar with this story, but when Aaron Burr lost to Jefferson in the election of 1800, he wanted to revive his failing political career. He was trying to figure out what he could do next. But right after that, Burr read some comments that Alexander Hamilton had made that were very unflattering to Aaron Burr. Alexander Hamilton had made some comments in some newspapers and to some people about Aaron Burr. He didn't like Aaron Burr, and he made that kind of public. Burr was hoping for some publicity, and so he challenged Alexander Hamilton to a duel. And if you know anything about that in England by this point, duels were illegal. Now, usually if a duel challenge is made, they resolve their differences peacefully, but in this case, Hamilton and Burr did not reconcile, and on the morning of July 11th, 1804, they threw dice to see who would fire first. Hamilton won, but he fired into the air. Burr shot his opponent in the stomach, and Hamilton died the next day. Burr was charged with murder, but he fled before he could be brought to trial. In 1806, he became involved in a plot to annex Mexico, which obviously failed. He was charged with treason, found not guilty, but he ended up fleeing to Europe and then coming back to New York, and he never was able to really revive his political career because of that. But for now, at least, he's Vice President of the United States. Now, this tricky election made the Founding Fathers realize that the way the Constitution had set up the electing of the president and the vice president wasn't exactly ideal. And so they changed it. And what we get is we get the 12th Amendment. The 12th Amendment created a separate ballot for president and vice president, and it was a direct result of this problem. It's one of the ways you can see how brilliantly our Constitution was put together, that we can create amendments to our Constitution, and while it's really difficult to pass an amendment, if everybody recognizes that this is something that needs to change, that this is a problem, we can fix it, right? Our Constitution isn't set in stone. It is difficult to change. We don't want something that we can just change willy-nilly, easy peasy, but we do want something that can be a little bit flexible, and here is some proof of that. We have the 12th Amendment now, which gives a separate ballot for president and for vice president. Now, let's talk about Jefferson's policies. Thomas Jefferson had some pretty strong ideas about how he was going to run the country, how he wanted things to go. Okay? He brought with him this style that was very different than John Adams. John Adams, if I remember correctly, was described as a bulldog. He was highly intelligent, everybody knew that, but he was not super likable. Jefferson had a much more likable style and personality, and he had very different political ideas from George Washington and from John Adams. And he wanted to limit the power of government. Jefferson was not a fan of a huge government. In fact, if Jefferson were here today, he would probably look at our incredibly large federal government and go, "You guys, what have you done?" Because he was really a fan of small government. Now, this is kind of fun. This is a fun story. When Jefferson was elected and he was going to give his first speech as president at his inauguration, there was this, Washington, D.C. wasn't the town that we know of now. It was a small town. The Capitol building was only partially completed. The executive mansion, which by the way wasn't called the White House yet, was there, and that was about it. Forests, homes, landscape. It wasn't the city that it is now. Small businesses. Anyway, there was a boarding house, and Jefferson was in the boarding house finishing his speech, and on the morning of March the 4th, 1801, he left that boarding house and walked to the Capitol. The reason he walked was because Jefferson believed that the leader of a republic should not ride in a fancy carriage. He read his speech, and in his speech, one of the things that he made very clear was that he supported the will of the majority. He stressed the need for a limited government, and he stressed the need for protection of civil liberties. Washington, D.C. would eventually grow to be a huge city, lots of monuments, and Jefferson would probably be pretty interested in that part of things because he was an architect himself and interested in that kind of thing. So I think he would probably be pretty pleased to see Washington, D.C., the city itself, as it has grown. Jefferson had to put his ideas into practice. That's one of the tasks, one of the hardest tasks that a new president faces is, okay, I have these things I want to do, I have these beliefs and these ideals, how am I going to put them into practice? So, one of the things every president does first time through, first thing in, is that they select their cabinet members. Here are a couple of people you need to remember for the cabinet members. I'm not going to give you all of them, but I am going to give you two important ones. The first one is James Madison. James Madison actually ends up being important for several reasons, but number one is that he is ends up later on becoming president number 4, James Madison. But James Madison was the Secretary of State under Thomas Jefferson. So that's what you need to know about him. He was Secretary of State under Thomas Jefferson. Very important. The other one that you're going to want to know about is Albert Gallatin. Albert Gallatin was the Secretary of the Treasury under Thomas Jefferson. Double check and make sure I spelled Gallatin correctly. And I did. Yay me. He was the Secretary of the Treasury under Thomas Jefferson. Now, Jefferson benefited from the fact that the Democratic Republican Party, which was, they didn't just win the presidency, they also won majorities in both houses of Congress. It's a lot easier for a president to get things done if he has support in Congress, and Jefferson most certainly did. So several things happened. First, the Alien and Sedition Acts were allowed to expire. They had an expiration date on them, and Congress chose not to renew them. So those expired, which everybody was happy about. Jefferson lowered military spending and reduced the size of the Army. Everybody was happy about that. The Navy was cut to 7 active ships. What they were trying to do was they were trying to repay the national debt. So they were trying to cut expenses so that they could get rid of the national debt. Jefferson asked Gallatin to find ways to get rid of taxes, and Gallatin did. In fact, he got rid of the tax on whiskey, which was very popular. And the Congress, which was led by the Democratic Republicans, passed all the laws that Jefferson needed to carry out his policies. So he was a success in that way because he had the support of the national government. In 1801, the entire national government, the whole federal government, consisted of a few hundred people. I mean, imagine that today. We have many thousands of people who are federal employees today. But in 1801, it was only a few hundred. And Jefferson actually wanted it to stay that way because what he believed was that the function of the federal government was pretty limited. That it was only to protect the nation from foreign threats, deliver the mail, and collect customs duties, collect tariffs. Jefferson recognized that some of the Federalist Party's policies were necessary. For instance, the creation of the Bank of the United States, which Jefferson had actually opposed at first. In fact, Jefferson really battled Alexander Hamilton over that. I mean, they butted heads bad over that. And but Jefferson ended up realizing that the Bank of the United States should be kept, and so it was kept. Now, Republicans controlled the presidency and Congress, but Federalists controlled the judiciary branch, the courts. Federal legislatures passed the Judiciary Act of 1801 right before their term of office ended. Right before it ended. Now, what this act did, and we talked about it a little bit in the last chapter, but what the Judiciary Act of 1801 did was it created 16 new federal judgeships. I wish I could talk and write at the same time. That would make things better. The Judiciary Act of 1801 created 16 federal judgeships. See, I can't write and talk at the same time. At the very last minute. Now, the Democratic-Republican press, because most of the journalists were on this side of the Democratic-Republicans, they called these midnight judges because right before John Adams left the presidency, he packed the judgeship, he packed the courts, these 16 federal judgeships, with Federalist judges at the very last moment. That's why they called them midnight judges. Packed the court, the judiciary, with Federalists the night before he left office. Literally the night before he left office. Now, this was late, very late in the game. Some of them were, in fact, so late that the documents that authorized the judgeships were not delivered by the time Adams left office. So we're going to have a problem. There's a man named William Marbury. And Marbury was named as a justice of the peace by President Adams. But he didn't receive his documents before Adams left office. When Jefferson took office, Marbury went in and said, Adams appointed me justice of the peace, I want my documents. Jefferson advised his new Secretary of State, James Madison, to refuse to deliver the documents. Jefferson's argument was that the appointment of the midnight judges was not valid. Okay, so Marbury brings suit, and this is actually going to be the first really big court case. Now, there were Supreme Court cases before, but this is going to be the first really big one. Marbury versus Madison. Marbury versus Madison was a court case in which William Marbury sued James Madison, and he asked the Supreme Court to order Madison to deliver those appointment papers. Marbury's argument was that the Judiciary Act of 1789 gave the Supreme Court the power to do so. What are they going to do? It's a man named John Marshall. John Marshall was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court during this time. In fact, he was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for 34 years. So much of the founding judicial opinions in the United States were overseen by John Marshall. Chief Justice for 34 years. John Marshall was a Federalist, and he had been appointed by John Adams.